everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today on Transport Day here at COP26. I'm joined by an expert panel and hopefully going to be asking some questions. So we're going to bust through some of the biggest questions around electric vehicles and some of the things that are keeping consumers up at night and the fears of the new generation and what's to come. I'm really keen to learn about this. I'm new to the electric world myself. I haven't had a kind of normal transition into electric. To give you an introduction on myself first, I'm a rally driver. I'm competing in Extreme, which is an off-road all-electric SUV championship for Andretti United. And we're basically racing in the most remote locations on the planet. So we've been in Greenland, Saudi Arabian desert, we've been in Senegal, and we're going to Amazon. So all of these places have obviously had effects from climate change. And in those locations, we're racing there, and then actually there's science legacy programs to restore them. And actually some of the scientists that are working here are our scientists on the committee that are leaving, I think, 5-year legacy programs in the location to help the economy with the local charities, but also repair the environment. So I've had a big adaptation to my lifestyle this year through racing electric. It's a very different kind of sport for me as a profession. And I know that that's kind of what we're here to talk about, is that change. It doesn't have to be doom and gloom. It's a fun thing. Driving is fun. And I think that's the kind of message. It's positive. We're going to be chatting about it in language that's accessible to everyone. So I'll introduce my panel. So up first, we have Fiona Howarth, who's a leading force in EVs. She heads up the Octopus electric vehicles, and she's kind of championing the transition into electric vehicles. So thank you for joining us. We've also got Charlotte Smith, who's sat to the side of me, and I actually listened to a podcast that you were on a few days ago, and I was blown away by how much you know already. So you're 15, aren't you? So
yes, I am.
Yeah, so Charlotte has been leaving thank you cards on electric vehicles since she was 12 to say thank you to the drivers for what they're doing and how they're going to be helping the planet. So I'm cool to hear more of that in a minute. We've also got Shaya Odkobe, who's the founder of Cycle to Class. And that's a really cool initiative. I was reading about that, how you're actually providing bicycles to children in sub-Saharan Africa, where the kind of distance to school is a barrier for their education. And aside from that, you're also a transport engineer with international experience in developing smart cities. I think in every continent. You've been in Africa, America, Europe, Asia. So massive overachiever. And finally, we have Lorna McAteer, who is the fleet manager at National Grid. So you're in charge of every vehicle, from helicopters to buses to cars, and more importantly, you're taking on the role of making the full fleet electric by 2030. So it's a big job, and we're all keen to hear more about that. So to start, I think we'll speak to Fiona first. I think one of the most common questions, I guess, around electric vehicles is the cost, and if they're more expensive. I know the government has a grant, I think it's £3,000 they give to kind of help you towards buying your new electric car, but does that really make a difference, and are they more expensive to buy as a consumer?
Thanks, Katie, and delighted to see you all here on Transport Day. What a fantastic place to be. So the cost of electric vehicles, it does cost more to make an electric car than it does to make an internal combustion engine. However, the cost of running that in life is actually a lot lower. So you can fill up your electric car on green energy at home overnight for almost 90% less, so 10% of the cost of that fuel versus the petrol diesel equivalent. And actually, because there's only about 20 moving parts in an EV compared to about 2,000 in an internal combustion engine car, much less goes wrong. So they are much lower cost to maintain and service as well. So there's a lot of other savings that you can make in life as well, which actually offsets some of that upfront cost. But there are other things as well. So you mentioned the grant. There's also a grant to get a home charge point at the moment, or a workplace charge point. Definitely recommend you get in there and get that set up. But also there's other things like other incentives, like there's a very low company car tax rate, which is making it very attractive for businesses to make that switch, or to do it on salary sacrifice as well. If you're an employer and you're really excited about that switch, then you can set up an employee benefit scheme, which makes it very attractive for your team to make that switch too.
And as we see, obviously, production increase over the next few years, will it become cheaper on the kind of high street for us? Are we better off waiting a bit to buy an electric car?
No, definitely don't wait, because even you can take it on a lease at the moment, and then the savings that you're making on petrol and diesel will offset any slight increase. And actually, side by side, they're pretty similar as well, because they tend to hold their value as well. So they have good residual values, which means that the leasing costs are very competitive. But in addition to that, we are absolutely seeing the costs come down. I mean, the cost of batteries have come down 90% in the last kind of 8 years or something. It's just a huge shift. And it also means not only is the cost coming down, but the range is getting longer. So now I know I'm probably jumping ahead in your questions, but the average range of an EV now is well over 200 miles. We've just launched a report this morning, Octopus with National Grid, and showing that the average range is 215 miles on electric cars today.
Wow, that's impressive, isn't it? Now, I've got Morgan Stanley's global auto team expects that 40% of new cars will be electric by 2030. That's kind of car purchases. Now then, in order to make that, we'd need to be producing 36 million cars a year, and expected this year is actually we'll produce 4 million. So when you consider that emissions are, 9% of our emissions are from passenger cars, do you think that we're on track to actually make that target?
Yeah, so if you'd asked me this question a couple of years ago, I'd probably have been a bit more sceptical, but what we have seen in the last 2 years has been an absolute landslide in terms of car manufacturers getting on board, making commitments, and really investing heavily in things like battery factories and just making that switch, even as recently as the last few weeks, seeing Ford making a big announcement about £11 billion investment, or $11 billion US dollars in the US and things. So huge shifts in terms of these kind of investments that are being made.
Yeah, absolutely. It's changing really quickly. And I think the sales we were going to talk about a bit later from September this year are really showing that. I think they actually equal 2019 sales in total. So
and of course, we're celebrating the huge leadership that we're seeing as well by the UK government in terms of the UK ban of petrol and diesel cars by 2030 even. And there will be some hybrids perhaps allowed longer than that. And we're seeing that across other vehicles now as well. So it's huge leadership, and it's really, really exciting.
And obviously, as you mentioned, with the end of the kind of combustion era on the roads, what are people going to do with their cars? Are they going to, because I've been reading that, you can repurpose them into electric if you want to kind of recycle to the best kind of case, but then it's sort of 20,000, I think, is the cheapest that will cost to do that. So it's not really accessible.
So the plan at the minute is really switching over those new sales of cars to being electric rather than necessarily making that big switch. Now, there might be more retrofit options as we move forward, but the key moment right now is let's not make more petrol and diesel cars. Let's make that switch as quickly as possible to electric now. And then people will still be driving their petrols and diesels for a bit longer, but as soon as we can switch over, the better.
Now, I've got a question for Lorna. Talking about kind of, I think, other than cost, the thing we talk about is kind of range anxiety. I know racing electric for me has been completely new. Normally, when I've been racing in rally in the past, we'll put petrol in and we'll go again. Whereas here, we're actually putting the car on charge and then having to wait for a couple of hours. So it's really affected our sport. But from more of kind of a high street perspective, what is that looking like at the minute? And is it a real thing that there is sort of range anxiety out there?
So, good morning, everybody. No. Fiona's already told you the average distance now that EVs can travel is over 200, about 215. But actually, it's more of a charge anxiety now. So there isn't a range anxiety. We know the cars can do this. We know the vans can do it. In fact, there's a rally going around Scotland at the moment where they're doing 1,200 miles from Monday till Friday, going around places. It's more of charging now. So it's the confidence behind the charge point networks. It's the confidence that when you get there, you're not going to have an ICE vehicle, as we call it, and they call it being ICE because somebody else is parked there. It's making sure that you actually know what you're doing and that you've got the right connection cards and everything else. So what we're seeing now is drivers are extremely happy with the vehicles. We just need a little bit more behind what's happening with the charge points, and that's what the government's doing. There's a lot of consultations out. There's new standards coming into play. You've got the contactless card now, which makes it easier for people to do. So the more we see of this, that's the new transition now. It's not range anxiety. It's a little bit of charge anxiety now.
And when we're actually looking, obviously you work for the National Grid. So I know it's not in your job role as your fleet manager, but are you able to tell us a little bit about how the National Grid is supporting the kind of infrastructure of increasing charging points on roads and supporting that?
Yeah, sure I can. So we have to remember that National Grid is the big transmission network. We move the power across. So what we're doing here is we're working with partners and bodies to understand what we need to put in place and where. So that 950 million rapid charge fund that's out to help people, that was solving a critical point failure in the network that other people couldn't do. So what we do is we are the enabler for the charging networks to do this going forward. So that's the key role we play in influencing and enabling. And what we need are the charge point people to come and ask us for connections.
Often we kind of see, electric cars as being, well, it is a lot better for our environment. I think everyone would agree that. But everybody sort of says, where does the energy come from? And is that something that National Grid is sort of looking into in terms of, can people sort of trace it back to see where they got their energy from to power their electric car when they're in a petrol station?
We can, and actually, at the beginning of the week, I've lost track of time. Actually, it might have even been last week now. We launched when to plug in. So there's an app from National Grid ESO that look at how the grid is made up, so you can see when it's at its greenest, when it isn't. And every year we are getting greener and greener in the grid. So we've got more renewables coming on. We've got a huge plan to have 40 gigawatts by 2030. So there is so much going in that direction, so that your whole end-to-end of driving that electric vehicle is as green as you can possibly get it.
Obviously, in the fleet, you haven't just got cars. You've got helicopters, you've got vans, you've got trucks. So I'm assuming as we're kind of moving towards a greener future, it's a very different journey for each of those. And what are some of the challenges for each of the different vehicles that you're looking at when you're trying to make them more sustainable?
So there are some common challenges and there are some different challenges. So the common one is behaviour. The drivers, the attitudes, what's needed and everything else. The different ones are what's available and when it's available. So my advice to other people on the same journey when it comes to HGVs is just plan what you've got. You've got your normal recycle placement programs. We know when we're going to get 4x4s around 2024, 2025. So don't panic about doing it any earlier. Do it when it's there. So it's control what you can control. So I don't have a solution yet for helicopters. There will be one in the future. I am absolutely convinced.
You cross that bridge when it comes to it.
Absolutely.
And obviously, as a massive company, I'm assuming your fleet is pretty big. Do you know how many vehicles you've got in total on the fleet?
So I've got over 3,000 vehicles on my little bit. We've got another 5,000 vehicles with Western Power Distribution, and we've got 8,000 to 9,000 vehicles over in the US.
Okay, so as a company that's obviously on that transition of setting that target of moving to electric, have you got any advice for any maybe smaller companies that are listening, or indeed large companies? Have there been any challenges that you've wished you'd kind of foreseen or that you'd prepared for when you've been thinking about making that move?
Just do it. And that sounds quite flippant, but actually just do it. You need to start planning. You need to think this through. It's going to take you longer than you think. Just because you're learning as much as anything else. So the sooner you can start, even if it's just one vehicle, then the next vehicle, then the next vehicle, and suddenly you'll realise you're where I am. Within 2 years, I've got over a third of my fleet of cars as electric now.
I guess it's kind of what Fiona was saying earlier about actually, it's, when you look at, I was kind of thinking the cost would be the massive thing if you're looking at, okay, we need to go out and buy 3,000 electric cars. But when you look at the company tax and you look at how long they're living for on the life cycle, it kind of makes sense in the long run, doesn't it? It's quite an attractive offer.
It does. And answering one of those questions earlier as well, 57% of new vehicles go into corporate fleets. So when you've got the incentives there on the corporate fleets, we've got stability now around the benefit in kind tax. We have stability now in terms of write-down allowances and other incentives. So the more the corporates can get those vehicles into fleet, the sooner those vehicles go into the second-hand market.
And there's lots of options on the market at the minute. I think if you're just kind of, right, okay, I'm going to buy a more sustainable car, you've got hybrid, you've got plug-in hybrid, you've got hydrogen, you've got electric. There's quite a lot of options out there. And I think, not necessarily now, but in the last few years, for example, I know in 2017 they moved, it was originally 2040 that we were going to have to be electric by, and now it's come forward to 2030. But with car manufacturers obviously pumping billions into their design of hybrid models, which are going to be phased out, I think, by 2035 now, the goalpost was moving, and I think there was a lot of frustration within the car industry of them trying to work towards an end goal. How have you felt dealing with the kind of uncertainty of that to begin with, or did you just kind of plough ahead and say, actually, no, it's a greener future for us, so regardless of these stipulations, we're going to go ahead with it?
I just went ahead. I actually set my target for 2030 before 2035 moved to 2030. And if I can do the same as Fiona, both of us, I think we'll try and make it 2023 if we could. It's just getting on and doing it. And yes, the goalposts have moved, but actually even the manufacturers knew all of this was a stepping stone because we are going to be doing this.
Exactly, it's inevitable. And I guess if you're looking at the deadlines, you're not really doing it for the right reasons. And we need to be thinking of the bigger picture of everything that we're kind of discussing here at COP26. So
absolutely.
Good point. I'm moving on to Shaya now. Obviously, you're a hugely experienced engineer with lots of international experience in lots of different cities. I was just wondering, if first of all, you could touch base on what you've kind of experienced in terms of transport. You've been involved with rail, with bike, with bus, designing in kind of smart cities. But have you noticed if any countries are doing it right and what we can sort of learn from them?
Yeah, well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. Yes, I think there are a lot of countries doing things right. There isn't one country that's gotten it all right, right? This is a journey. And I think we need to take recognition of the different transport preferences and also availabilities in different countries. And to that extent, we then rate different countries along that journey. Of course, in Europe, Norway's doing really well. The UK, that's been touched on just but I think at the end of October, last October, there were more over 300,000 fully electric vehicles on the road. And if you had plug-in hybrid, that's over 600,000, just under 700,000. Right, so there is a progress somewhere. Germany is also doing that. Sold about or registered 17% of the vehicle registered by the end of September were full electric. Many other countries are still on that journey and learning from each other. But that's not just all the countries that that I know that are doing things. There are other countries in Asia or even Africa that have different modes of transport. So in India, for example, the three-wheelers are more in terms of usage for a lot of people. More than 50% actually of the three-wheeler vehicles, the rickshaws in India, are actually electrified right now. And I think it's important to credit and also recognize a lot of countries that have different mode of transport, not necessarily cars, but are also on this journey and are doing it right. Of course, China has been on this journey a long time as well. The infrastructure is improving, is built, and of course, the value chain is well developed there. So, recognition of countries in terms of two-wheelers or motorbike for the means of public transportation, or three-wheelers, they're all doing things at their own pace because of the infrastructure that may not be available for full electric vehicles.
That was kind of my next question, really. So what to you is the limiting factor for in places or areas of the sector that we're not seeing progress at the minute? Is it infrastructure, or is it money, or resources?
I think you really just answered that question. Infrastructure is huge. To have a charging infrastructure for a full electric vehicle is billions of dollars or pounds or whatever currency. But what we're also seeing is not just that. There's also some social, obviously cultural, barriers and some, but financing, right, is also a large part. In India, for example, you have the rickshaws, the electric rickshaws, and individuals that want to actually buy them, but can't afford it. But what you found is, there are non-bank financing institutions that have stepped in to really support those individuals. You also have for last mile deliveries, some companies that are paying and for the employees in terms of a lease scheme to enable them to do that. That being said, in a continent like Africa, where you have huge issue with power, now 50% of the population don't have access to energy. So when I don't even have electricity to power my phone or just my home, how can I get this conversation around powering my electric vehicle, right? So that's, of course, a lot of things that needs to be sorted out in terms of infrastructure, but also policy is a big. But there are countries that are supporting, albeit in an early stage, in terms of just understanding how to restructure the tax and the tariff to enable the countries and citizens to be able to move into that transition, either through three-wheelers or electric vehicles or buses.
And to look a bit more into the difference between developed and developing countries, I know this is a big topic, as you said, it's not black and white in some areas. As you said, we've got lots of different vehicles coming up, but just to talk a bit more about that in your experience, obviously we've got the decarbonising three-wheelers in India, as you were talking about. Is there any other examples that you could share with us of stuff that we could learn, I guess, and from different countries?
Sure. I think I touched on maybe more on India earlier, but let's sort of go to Africa now. And there is a lot going on, and there's some things we can learn in terms of innovation. And this is what happens when really you don't have, when there's a lot of barriers. What really happens is people are stirred up to create things. All right, so there's a lot of innovation startup actually in East Africa. Kenya has almost been the center of the transition of electric vehicle. Again, not necessarily cars, but thinking around two-wheelers or three-wheelers. I think by the mid of this year alone, there were more than 50 startups in that in that space, really looking to tackle these. Some are manufacturing or assembling the electric vehicles in that country. Through the UNEP Global E-Mobility Program, that's really supported a lot of African countries as well. We see Rwanda really leading charge as well, with just a restructuring of policy, enabling the environment and creating the space for investment as well. And in North Africa, Morocco also have a plan, in the next sort of 10 years to improve efficiency, and Egypt actually have planned. I think by this time next year they should have sort of build their own first hundreds of electric vehicle. So what is really happening, what we can learn is the supporting environment, the innovation that is coming up, even through battery swaps as well on these three-wheelers or two-wheelers, which means that you don't need to wait so long, to charge. You can just go to these hubs where you just swap your battery, and you move on. It takes exactly the same time if you're using a ICE vehicle, and if you're going to fill up with petrol. All right, so that's the way that some of these.
Need that in my race
countries
car.
are.
So changing the topic slightly here, obviously with the extra demand on resources, especially cobalt, copper, nickel, lithium, all the things we kind of read about, what, in your experience, especially kind of where we're mining these and things like that, how do you think we're going to meet that demand, and what kind of pressure is that putting on the supply chain? And also, how do we keep it an ethical process? I know we're really trying to quickly speed up the rate that we get these materials mined, but I think there's a lot of different things to think about. It's quite a big question, I know, but if you've got any thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, that's a very important question. I think the supply chain question comes up a lot, and it's not. It is a very complex system, and of course the value chain as well. So in terms of countries, so lithium, for example, the largest sort of producer of lithium, is Australia, Chile, China, I think Argentina as well. There are other countries as well, much with some reserves or resource. Nickel, cobalt, manganese or copper are also available in China, South Africa, Zimbabwe. Sorry, not Zimbabwe. DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and what we are seeing, is even though you have, let's take DRC for example, where you can mine cobalt. The next phase of that is to refine it, right? So even though you have all these countries with these resources and reserves, and by the way, I don't actually think, I think there's enough reserve and resource that can really support this transition. But the issue then is, the refining, and then going on to the manufacturing of that. And then at the end of that is, how do we recycle this back? So China so far obviously is responsible for, I think, 80% of raw mineral refining, about 77% of cell battery manufacturing, and about 60% of battery cell components manufacturing. So you have a country very concentrated with being able to mine, refine, and then obviously manufacture, creating a bit of a barrier or supply blockers for other countries that they need it. So in terms of manufacturing, what needs to be done, I believe, is the construction. Well, actually before that, in terms of the mining, we need to open our new mines, but that could take a long time. You can have up to 15 years sometimes to actually commission a mine, get the right regulatory approval, and making sure that it is conducive and there are a lot of ethical, sort of good practices on this mine. So that's an issue. That's an issue on its own, especially where you have large reserves and then a lot of concerns at the moment in a place like DRC. And then on the manufacturing side, I think there's just not enough, right, gigafactories in the scale which we want to make and go over the transition. But UK is doing a good job with British Volt, for example. We're going to be manufacturing, batteries here for different OEMs, and I think that needs to be recognized. But there's need for more of that. Again, it takes time to build such factory, right? Nothing. I mean, it probably take you, even if you fast track it, at least 3 years to get all things right. And then when it comes to the, I think the next phase of then, recycling this. And yes, there are, researches and studies and views around recycling of batteries and how do you really make use of them. But it's complex and really the economics doesn't stack up sometimes. And maybe actually cheaper to actually manufacture a new lithium battery than, try to recycle that. And on the last point, I think there's also, and this has happened post-pandemic with stimulus package and a lot of sort of investment into enabling EV. Is the OEMs and manufacturers need to talk more to the battery manufacturers and give a clearer projection in terms of what the output will look like, and that would then help those that are mining or refining or actually manufacturing to be well prepared to meet that demand. And I think that there is a lot going on right now about that, but also where you do find a place to then either replace materials like cobalt, it almost forms a vicious cycle again, because then you drive the price of lithium, for example, or the alternative material. So in terms of innovation, that's important to really think about how can we sustain beyond these minerals that we've just listed. What other ones are there, elements that can actually help with manufacturing a battery, but there always seem to be some unintended consequences when you explore new elements, either on environmental implications or the impact on indigenous communities. These are things where that all needs to be discussed and really thought through. But yeah, clearly not an easy space in terms of the mineral resources. Yeah.
Well, that was really interesting. I think you covered some really important points there, so thank you. We can't not talk about, I know we're focusing on electric vehicles, we can't not talk about your campaign, Cycle to Class. Could you just quickly tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Well, Cycle to Class is an initiative that I started based on my father's sort of experience living in Southwest Nigeria and walking to school like 60 years ago, walking long distance to school because of no means of transport. And the studies out there, more than 10 plus million children walk long distance to school in Nigeria, for example, and out of school. And one of the contributing factor is geographical disparity. Just in the rural communities, children have to walk long distances, and because of that, they won't attend school. So, as a transport, specialist, and building, smart transport in urban areas, I think is important as urbanization, sort of increases the next few years, not just to teach children how to ride bicycles, and so that when they move to cities, then they think about sustainable means and non-motorized transport ways. But underlying that was really trying to tackle this education piece by breaking that barrier so that children can get the best out of life. And we've given out more than 300 plus bicycles to children in really deep rural communities that have no access, walk long distances over 2 hours sometimes. We train them how to ride bicycles, and we've seen improvement in terms of their attainment, the attendance to school, and generally the attitude as well and aspiration. And that's one of the ways that we're also, thinking around transport, the impact and the use of transport, and also electric two-wheelers in some rural communities are being used and explored in some African countries as well to support women and children and local farmers as well to get the produce back into markets. So, Yeah.
Very cool. I was actually racing in Senegal earlier this year, and
Alright.
part of our legacy project, what we were sponsoring out there was with school children. It was actually becoming a climate change was actually becoming a compulsory topic for them at school. So I just wanted to hear quickly, and then we'll move on to Charlotte. Obviously you spent a lot of time in Sub-Sahara on this project. I was wondering, and not just in Africa, but also internationally, if you've spoken to children, what their kind of the international and the differences might be on their kind of beliefs and thoughts around climate change, or if everybody's really engaged in it, and particularly with the electric movement as well, in countries where they may not necessarily see it on the road every day.
Sure. Very, very good question. I think the topic on climate change is still a very nascent stage for a lot of children, not even adults on the continent. Some of the children that we've worked with, really climate change is not really a topic for them because to be fair, they really don't have vehicles. They walk most places. Where they live is very green, and so that topic is not really an issue for them. However, that being said, it's important that as they obviously move into cities and just understanding the impact of even how they live is really important. And I think your initiative and time you spend with kids, that's ways to start sort of giving this insight to children to understand how the world really connects and the impact of emissions. So
That's really interesting. Thank you. So Charlotte, sorry, it's taken me a while to get back to get to you. It'd be lovely to hear from you. Obviously, you've spoken through your project, which I'm sure you'll tell us a bit about. You've spoken to a lot of different consumers, and I was interested to hear on the behavioural changes that you've noticed, if you have, and also what the biggest fear you think is for people that are looking into the electric world.
So I'm Charlotte, and I am a 15-year-old children's health campaigner. And from the age of 11, I've been thanking pioneering electric vehicle drivers for helping to protect the health of children as they're not creating any tailpipe emissions. And I thank them with my EV thank you cards, which read, "Thank you for choosing an all-electric vehicle. You're helping children like myself to breathe easier and avoid long-term illnesses, such as stunted lung development, brain illnesses, cancer. Thank you. Charlotte, age 15. Around over the 4 years I've been doing this campaign I've learned that when EV drivers first receive my EV thank you cards, they realize that, they don't realize, or when someone hears my campaign message in whatever form, so that could be when I was on the BBC News or radio, or just or my YouTube channel as well. One of the first things they do is generally just, they realize that driving an electric vehicle isn't only helping to protect the health of children, the planet, but it's also helping to protect the health of children. And over the 4 years, I've noticed that when they go over on their social media platforms, firstly, the people that I generally catch their tweets and Facebook posts about are to their family and friends, just being like, "Whoa, I got this card, I'm super excited. I did think it was a ticket, but it wasn't. It was a thank you card." So you see them and you're like, "That's really touching." And then you see that those people following them, because the majority of people still aren't driving an EV at this point, they are hearing from their family and friends that driving an electric vehicle isn't only about the planet, which of course is a completely valid reason, because if you're looking after the planet, it's going to help all of us air quality wise and the world in general, but it's also about children's health. And for some people that might be more relatable, since most of us have children or are related to children in some way, and even if we're not, we want the best for the next generation. So it's a definite motivation for those ICE drivers to realize, wait, so this is an added reason as to why I should buy an electric vehicle. And also, I've noticed that when I give out my EV thank you cards, the response I get is always completely positive, but the cards, so it's a little bit like if you give out an EV thank you card and you're trying to explain to people that this is a reason to go electric, and then you see that businesses obviously go towards electricity. Sorry, I'm really nervous.
I think, round of applause for Charlotte. Isn't she doing amazing, honestly?
Okay.
I'm trying to think what I was doing at 15. It definitely wasn't standing on a stage like this, so it's really inspiring.
So when I started my campaign, I realized that I didn't quite notice why ICE drivers necessarily weren't going electric, because as a 11-year-old when I started this campaign, the campaign seemed a bit of like a no-brainer, because when I was in year 5, around age 10, I had to do a science paper for school on changes. So I decided to do it on the change between ICE, internal combustion engine, and electric. And throughout that process, I not only learned a lot about electric vehicles in general, but also about the benefits that they have on children's health. Now, at the time, especially 4 years ago, it's constantly getting better, but EV uptake and EV adoption was still relatively low. So I wanted to thank those truly pioneering electric vehicle drivers, literally paving the way, since not too many other people were doing it, especially since now the charging infrastructure, since they're going in like KFCs, literally like pretty much anywhere you go, including hotels, you have integrated charging infrastructure. But back then it wasn't quite as great as it is now. So it was a conscious decision. It still is, but when you walk into like a car dealership, it's very much, I'm walking in there for a purpose, to buy an electric vehicle. And whether at the time they bought an electric vehicle thinking this is for children's health, which often I haven't found it to be just yet, but even if it's just for sporty reasons, because they're quite vast, they're quite nice, but even if it's just for sporty reasons or for environmental reasons, which again, as I've said, is an amazing reason to get an electric vehicle, but it's just adding that cherry on top, like tying it all together. And as I've noticed, so when EV drivers receive my card, I direct them to my YouTube channel, and I noticed that behavioural change, as you said, is a really key part into getting people into electric vehicles. So I decided I wanted to create a series on my YouTube channel called ICE to EV. It's an ICE to EV guide which takes an ICE driver, petrol or diesel driver. I take them like by the hand and show them all the way from what is an EV, because some people don't like acronym. It's an acronym. It's not even an electric vehicle. It can be quite complicated to start off with, to know what to search for. So you got EV, and then take them all the way through to owning an electric vehicle, and comparing things like CCS, CHAdeMO, different types of charging connectors, to petrol and diesel. It's just like two different types of fuel, which is this time it's renewable and it's helping to protect children's health. To simplify it down to things that they're already familiar with. So in this, I take them all the way through that, and then I kind of round it all off by kind of showing them this is like the way to go, because of how easy it is to start off with. Like, of course, children's health, my thing, my whole reason why I'm doing my campaign. Taking them all the way through it and ending it off with like, these are all so easy. Maybe in the past, maybe a few years ago, it was more difficult with infrastructure. But now the infrastructure is definitely pulling through. It's in places, even on long journeys, because things with your range, like people worry about range quite often. And to go on a quite side note, about a year ago, I had a Mark 1 Nissan Leaf, which was 80 miles, and I went from the Midlands, which is where I'm from.
I hope you weren't driving.
No, it's my dad. All the way from the Midlands through to Dundee in 24 hours. That's a 1,000 mile trip in an 80-mile Leaf. Like with charging, everything. Like it's quite a feat, but it worked. Yeah. And now, like vehicles, if you're getting them second-hand, which can be from around that £5,000, again, price like becoming less and less of an issue as the years go on, especially with second-hand vehicles being even closer to £5,000 if you buy them second-hand. And so if you're like tying it through to when you're traveling and then you've got a low-mile vehicle. But now that's becoming less of an issue with higher range electric vehicles coming in. So you have to charge less frequently, charge is increasing. So I'd say one of the biggest things for behavioural change, linking back to your question, is just the fear of unknown, of not knowing what to expect when going into an electric vehicle. Yeah. And that's why on my ICE to EV guide series, I take them through all these things which have already been answered. They've already been answered, just maybe like compiling it all together into a place you can go for the series of answers that you wouldn't have maybe thought of before.
Well, I think you'll definitely have some new subscribers in the room. That sounds amazing. And actually, it sounds really useful because, as you say, we often overcomplicate things too much with acronyms. And we need to make it more accessible so that the kind of the general audience will understand it. You mentioned that you started in school with this was being a school project. That's what kind of led you to these thank you cards. I was just interested to learn, obviously, you've had an invested interest in it and you've carried on and you've probably done a lot more than your friends at school in this space. But do you think in general you learn enough at school about sort of climate change and the importance of electric vehicles, or do you think that we could still improve that?
Well, obviously all schools are different, and my school experience may have been different from someone else that went to a different school. But for me, I have been exposed to some areas, especially because I took GCSE geography. That's a big factor with the whole climate. But I think perhaps it could be included in subjects like ethical studies, which is a subject where we go into things that are ethical, so that could incorporate that. But also I had an idea a few months back, which I haven't quite incorporated just yet, but to go to schools and talk there about my children's health campaign to children, because one of the great things about being a child is when you learn something, you get all excited about what you've just learned, no matter what your age is. So who's the first person as soon as you get home you're going to tell? It's your parents. So if you told the children this is a reason to go electric, it helps to protect our health, and just tell them like a bunch of cool facts about electric vehicles, because they are pretty cool.
They are. That game in the Tesla's pretty fun as well, isn't it?
Yeah, and then. And reasons to go electric, and then they go home, they tell their parents, and then their parents might be like, if they've heard it on the news or elsewhere, because most people would have heard about electric vehicles in some way, shape or form to this point, it adds another layer, as my campaign does, to buying an electric vehicle.
Absolutely. As we all know, we've spoken about it a lot. The world isn't simple in terms of moving into the electric sense. There's lots of different options of cars on the market. We talk about recycling. We talk about cost. We talk about mining. Do you think that these choices that are obviously coming in by governments, do you think that they kind of listen to the young voices enough? Obviously, the young people are in the driving seat of the future. People like yourself and other activists in the UK that have really got invested interest in. Do you feel like your voice is heard and that you have the opportunity to share your ideas, or have you even had any light bulb moments of solutions to things that you think, actually, I've got a really good idea for that you'd like to share with everybody?
Yeah, well, obviously I've got today to speak to people, to speak to like leaders that can change things for my generation as well. And I have come up with a couple ideas in trying to get my campaign message out there to other people. So that includes me talking on my YouTube channel. So I have a series of YouTube videos where I talk about different experiences I've had with my campaign, and to try and push them further to higher places. Because one thing I've noticed that if I reach not only just customers, because customers, of course, talking to the consumers is very important, because if their mindsets change, it's all about just behavioural change, but if their mindsets change, then companies will inevitably change with them. Because if you like, they want something that the companies are going to be giving them. So yeah. But also to get to higher places, to talk to people, to have the opportunities to discuss among like higher course, like people, adults that make these decisions for my generation. And also because running an international children's health campaign for about 4 years now, it's kind of just either campaigning or school, which I'm not complaining about, because this is the most passionate thing I am about. This is basically a factor of my personality. But to be able to talk to children, to give them, like, even if it's just 30 seconds, talking to them like, what are your thoughts about electric vehicles? Because being at school, I talk to students, kids all the time, and they are definitely opinionated about many things, but within the whole EV area, definitely opinionated and definitely want it to happen. But because you got football, you got sports, you got clubs, you got other things that go on outside in your exterior life, running a whole international children's health campaign can be a bit much and also a bit intimidating, because speaking on stage, again, is quite nerve-wracking for anyone, but also especially children my age, older and a little bit younger. And to give them just 30 seconds on my YouTube channel to say their opinions, to say their thoughts and feelings on electric vehicles, because, of course, I know that they do have them. Yeah. And I think that will be really beneficial for government leaders, government companies to see them, to then act on that, because perhaps children's voices aren't being heard necessarily as much, because it's just a factor of how do children get their voice out there.
Yeah. Well, that's really interesting. Thank you, and I'm sure we'll all be checking out your YouTube channel. So I want to leave some time for questions at the end. So I've just got one last question for everybody in the room. Obviously, everybody in the room, all the panelists, I mean, are very unique experts in and also championing the decarbonisation of transport in their own right. So just individually, quite quickly, I'd like you to share your message in the room to the policymakers that are sat in here and what it is that you feel is the most important thing to be said.
Well, actually, just before I do share my kind of summing thoughts, there's been a lot of talk around how fighting climate change needs everyone, and it needs collaboration, it needs us all to work together. And I just think Charlotte is just living it. And there's a lot of young people that want to get involved, and she just is leading from the front in terms of doing that. And I just wanted to really recognise that, and thank also the UK Pavilion and National Grid for inviting Charlotte to be here, because I think it's absolutely fantastic. I think we've got to be ambitious. I think if you haven't yet driven an EV, go out and drive one, because as you heard from a number of people, they're really fun. They are cost competitive in terms of running costs. Just get out there and live it. It's fun. Let's make this happen.
Well, on my side, I think from an international perspective, more important to work with countries that are still very early stage in understanding the concept, but also some of the buzzwords that we use over here, and the narrative generally need to be, I think, reshaped for people to better understand. A lot of collaboration, education, we touched on that, of course, is important, and of course more champions like Charlotte, of course, and a different continent. More importantly, I think, is collaboration with a lot of the UNEP is doing a fantastic job in Africa on the e-mobility program, but just lessons to be learned, but also recognition that it's not all just about cars as well. I've touched on the different modes of transport, and it's learning and understanding how to really know that it's not one size fits all in terms of electric vehicle transition.
Just to add a little bit to what you were saying is something I've learned is that to get ICE drivers into EVs, you need to just answer their questions, because they do have questions whether they're saying it or not, whether they're super pro going EV yet or not, and just taking away all that fear factor for them, as we're doing today, talking through it and answering some of their questions that they may be having, and then also I'd say the value of my campaign, just to say it in a clear way, is it's a little bit like if you sprinkle some seeds across a field, for example, and you haven't quite prepared this field yet, but you're sprinkling these seeds on anyway. And you're coming back a few months later hoping to see a field full of crops. But if we take the time to prepare this soil beforehand, and answer any questions that these EV drivers may have, taking away that fear factor, and then when we come back, we're more likely to see a field full of EV adoption. And in this reason, this is why I believe my campaign message needs to be heard wherever there's children all around the world.
Amazing, thank you. And finally, over to Lorna.
So thank you. And I just want to kind of reiterate how powerful Charlotte's message is, because I got one of her cards a couple of years back, and I was at rock bottom with my team, trying to make the changes, trying to get things through, and we were really, really struggling. And that card arrived and actually made me cry, because I then took a photo of it straight away and just sent it into my team saying, this is why we do this. And it gave us the motivation again to just keep going and ploughing through the challenges that we had. So I guess my message is out there is, when I was at school, one of the lessons I got was necessity is the mother of invention. That was one of those quotes we had. And I think my message out there to everyone is, we've got to stop doing what we're doing, and we have to be creative and do something different. We need to work together to do this, and we can only do it by working together, and we only win when we all work together.
That's very powerful. Thank you.
Katie,
yes.
I actually have something for you for giving me and my campaign the opportunity to speak about it, because it is kind of rare for Avicine, and I really love talking about about my campaign to people like everyone in the room, even though it can be a little bit scary, but push through it. And I actually have an EV thank you badge for you.
Oh, look at that.
I give them out to anyone who donates to my children's health campaign, because I have a Patreon, GoFundMe, and PayPal. And also, anyone that like gives me the opportunity to get my campaign message even further out there, and I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I'll take this on behalf of National Grid and the UK Pavilion, so thank you for having us all here. It's been a really engaging audience, so I'd love to open up the last 10 minutes to some questions. If anyone's got any for any of our panellists today, yes.
No, that's a really good question, actually. When I put my transport hat on, that's the same question. You know, is the debate or the conversation moving away from sustainable transport of walking and cycling, and people suddenly feel like they need to get electric vehicle because suddenly it is cleaner, and and I think there's need to be a balance there, right? For very shorter trip, should be more encouragement. Certainly in the last few years, there was a lot, and of course a lot of investment even across UK, in London in particular, with cycling routes, and definitely there was an increase in that, especially when the lanes became more safer. So that needs to carry on, and I think we need to have this conversation as well to make sure that they're not relegated. Because ultimately on the health basis, but also on the mission, that is sustainable and cleaner. And I think, yes, certainly it's again a behavioral change. It's taking a lot of work to even get people to start walking and cycling. But also now not telling them to get into their car for shorter trips. So that education needs to continue, knowing exactly for what particular purpose, journey purpose, do I need my vehicle, and do I truly need it as well. So certainly not everyone needs to get an electric vehicle. There are other alternatives and choices to use.
So I take that responsibility on as a corporate fleet manager as well. So in parallel to changing my vehicles from one to the other, that is just a replacement. What I'm actually doing is using COVID as the catalyst to explain to people, actually, you didn't need your car in the first place, do you? So why do you still need it? So I'm currently gathering data to understand every single trip, whether that's the commute into work, the business trip, what it is, looking at mobility as a service solutions, modal shift solutions, and everything I'm doing is I'm actually now trying to remove vehicles as much as I am in terms of replacing it. We've put an electric bus on our fleet in order to do our commuters so that we go around and pick them up from the train stations in Seth. It's a whole educational piece and something I'm trying to do in parallel to just shift from one to the other, because we all know the cleanest mile is the one we don't do.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Lucia Dorantes. I'm coming from Cambiamo Change Mobility. And yeah, I agree with the comment before. And I would like to go a step further, for example, talking about public transportation, especially in developing countries, using EV vehicles for minibuses and so on for public transportation might be a really more efficient solution for going beyond and really reducing pollution and the environmental problems associated with normal vehicles. But we still have burdens, and we still have problems regarding public transportation and EV vehicles. Could you provide any ideas or solutions on how to go further on and give the public transport companies, empower the public transport companies by using EV vehicles, or really pushing forward for that?
I can quickly go first on that. I think for public transportation in particular, so I didn't probably not touch on that, but the electric buses that are been tried in different places, been used even in some other emerging cities, even been manufactured. I read about an interesting startup in Uganda, I think last year, that actually manufactured electric buses, or assembled them at least for the purpose of public mass transportation, and that is increasing in India as well. Some of the state and municipalities are really increasing and encouraging electric buses in terms of manufacturing, but also being able to sort of move mass people around. So there is on the bus operator side, but also on the authority, there's a lot of encouragement towards that, and it just needs to be more in sort of investment and also education for people.
Yeah, I mean, there might be some examples that we can also take. I don't know if you've seen the first buses as well, even driving around Glasgow at the minute, that are electric, and part of the Hitachi and Octopus partnership there that are kind of helping power those. And so there might be some example fleets that we can even take case studies from that we might be able to look at in terms of how you charge up and you set up that charging infrastructure and so forth in different areas.
We've seen it in London as well, so where we've got the black taxi cabs, where we've put the clean air zones in, and they've been banned. So the public actually wait for the electric taxi cab to come by instead of jumping in the diesel one. So we're actually seeing a behavioural change and choice, that people are actually making that conscious decision to get into the electric one instead.
Yes, David Woolcombe, Peace Child International, whose mission statement is empowering young people. So thank you for inviting Charlotte, because you are a fabulous role model to the young people that we meet. But I have a question which you may have covered earlier. I was a little late. And it's very simple. I'm trying to persuade my wife to buy an EV, and she won't, because her friend who bought one tells the nightmare story that there are 8 different charging cards on the EV charging places in the UK. And inevitably you turn up and the one that you find has the wrong charge card. When are we going to synchronize all the charging facilities in the UK so that wherever you find yourself, you can actually get charged on one of the electric charging points?
Probably Lorna.
I was actually hoping we'd get some announcements today from them, but the government have been doing consultations on it. So we are already seeing lots of contactless charging cards as we go out there. There are standards coming through, and there is work moving on it to move everybody off the apps and actually go for interoperability amongst all the chargers so that you can do that. So I expect to see it in physical operation within the next year to 2 years.
And there are also already some examples where you can get a single card that actually consolidates across a number of different charge point operators. So the Electric Juice Network, if you were to have a look at that from Octopus, not to promote it, but it is there, and you can get a single card, and it does a significant number of charges. In fact, 100,000 charges across Europe, including the UK.
I'm not sure if you're familiar, you might be, but the zapmap, which is like a app that you use, and it will show you all the charges that are. So you go into like filter, and then you can select all the settings for your car, how many kilowatts you want it to be, what charging provider you want it to be, so that you can find them all near you, and it'll tell you if it's working, in use, or like however basically tell you all the details of that charger. So it means that even obviously the goal is to get them all to be either using like a debit or credit card or like a universal card for it. But as of right now, zapmap is a really great app that you can use to just see where firstly where chargers are, and then also if they're in use, working, or also the provider.
Just give your wife's details to Charlotte.
I think we've got time probably for one more question. So I don't know who's got the microphone in this.
Hi there, Jacob Roberts from the Association of Renewable Energy and Clean Technology. I've been working in the sort of EV space for quite a long time, and one of the reflections I have is that a lot of the really rapid transition tends to be driven by really inspirational and talented individuals. And I don't think anyone in this room would deny that we've got 5 of such individuals here, so thank you very much for your topic. My question was actually for Lorna specifically. You mentioned that National Grid has a fleet of around 8,000 or 9,000 vehicles, I think it was, in the US. I was wondering what have you learnt from the different challenges of rolling out electric vehicles in different markets?
That the US have 4x4s and I don't. The challenges tend to be more vehicle specific. They also tend to be down to use. So one of the mantras I've always had as a fleet manager is right vehicle for the right job. Now all I've added into that mantra is right fuel type at the right time. So the challenges are between it is what is my fuel source going to be? When am I going to be putting it on? So the challenges are the same. It's always a behavioural shift. It's a vehicle technology shift. It's an infrastructure shift. It's just when. And that's the main difference, really.
We probably have got time for one more question. We've got an eager arm in the corner.
I'm Ian Lumley with the Irish NGO group here, An Taisce the National Trust for Ireland, and we run a part of the Green Schools programme, a green transport, because so many journeys in urban areas, it's obviously tougher for people in rural areas, are short journeys that could be replaced by cycling. And then we have a major problem with SUVs, and there's a display out there in the outdoor area beside the Armadillo of an electric SUVs. But those of you who travel here from the city centre, you go under this big high-level bridge that was opened by the Queen in 1970, the Kingsland Bridge, which is a monster motorway. And I see, air quality progress, yes, if those cars, are replaced by EVs. Of course, there's an externalization of impact somewhere else in the production of those cars and in the sourcing and production of the battery sourcing. But I'd like to ask Charlotte, to what extent are you addressing the need to combat and eliminate the use of excessive and selfish SUVs, particularly in urban areas? And to what extent are you promoting non-car ownership? So we've now moved to a situation, and it's very much led in Germany, where people can join apps, and if you're living in an urban area, you can, if you've got good public transport and cycling routes, you don't need to own a car. You can hire one now and again. Are you promoting that as an alternative?
My campaign is a very focused campaign. It focuses strictly on how zero-emission vehicles do not produce any tailpipe emissions and how they do not cause any of the illnesses I stated on my card. And my campaign goal strictly sticks to everyone going towards a zero-emission form of transport, no matter if that's, say, renewably sourced hydrogen or electricity, or anything that's purely zero emission, doesn't create any tailpipe emissions. And that is as far as my campaign kind of goes in that area, and that's kind of where it stops.
Maybe we could have a conversation afterwards with some of the other panelists that might be able to go into more detail specifically on that. But as Charlotte said, she's been focusing on the kind of health sector. But thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. Sorry we've run over by a few seconds. I'm sure everyone's going to be sticking around. I know there was a few more questions, so feel free to grab them. But yeah, thank you for joining us. It's been a really engaging audience.